All right. We got a couple people. Cool. Got some people watching. More than just the three of you. Yeah. I think spring semester is going to be a little bit different. A little bit different. So, lab, next week, we got everything set up. We'll analyze our data, and then lab is open because you'll make your diaspores for that final week of class. We've got a quiz that went live Wednesday. Make sure you get that done. We'll have an exam next week, Friday. It'll open up about 5 in the morning. Close, I think you're going to have to start it by 11 o'clock at night. So that way you can get it finished. And hopefully it works as planned. So try some different things. All right, let's continue this. Reproductive value is where we left off. So just kind of a quick review. You know, we introduced this idea of reproductive value, which gauges current and future reproduction relative to just surviving today. And the concept is that organisms are faced with this choice of, should I invest my energy, my limited energy, into surviving today so that I can reproduce tomorrow, or should I invest my energy into reproducing today because I might not live to tomorrow? So the distinction kind of between these decisions kind of comes down to, what is our chances of surviving today, and what does my reproductive output or outlook look like in the future? If the outlook is better, and if it looks like we're going to be able to survive to that point, then it's probably better to wait to reproduce until a later time, until you've had a chance to grow. If it doesn't look like you're going to be able to survive to that time, then the organism needs to invest all its energy into reproducing because it might not live. It might not live. All right? So where did this come into play? It came into play with our life history strategies. So our strategies, as you're going to see moving forward, it's going to deal with growth rates. How should we grow? When should we start to reproduce, and so forth? It'll deal with lifespans. How long should we live? And it's going to deal with our reproductive effort. How many times should we reproduce? How many offspring should we have? How much energy should we invest in each individual, and so forth? And those strategies, the suite of strategies, is what determines this reproductive value, this VX. So this VX, this reproductive value, is our proxy for fitness, but we don't measure it as a single data point. What we have to do is look at this VX over the course of the lifetime of the individual, or the lifespan of the individual. And what we get is a curve that I'll call the reproductive value curve. So this is just one curve. In general, our VX curve is going to be triangular shaped. All right, it's going to form this triangle where you have an increase, you reach a peak, and then you have a decrease. All right, so why do we have this shape? Well, the increase is all due to increasing survival. Increasing survival, increasing reproductive output. So, you know, a lot of times we talked about early on in life, you have high mortality rates. All right, well, with those mortality rates, your outlook for life, for reproduction, isn't very good. So you're going to have a low reproductive value. But with each day and each year that you live, you get closer and closer and closer to reproductive maturity because of survival, which means our reproductive value is going to be increasing. We're going to be more valuable as we get closer and closer and closer to reproducing until we hit our peak reproductive age. So once we start reproducing, we've hit our peak reproductive value. Anything after that point then is going to be a decline in our value because we've passed our peak, our reproductive output's likely going to suffer, but more importantly, we're approaching the end of our life. We're approaching our maximum lifespan. All right? So the shape is really tied to survival and reproductive outputs. All right? We do get to 0. Now, at this point, our individual may have died. All right, that may be the end of their lifespan, or for, let's say, humans, we reach the point where we just stop reproducing, but we still live. All right, and that kind of has an important role too, because you do have parental care that could extend past the reproductive years. Past the reproductive years. So, once we get to this point, we might not have any more reproductive contribution to the population, but we might still be contributing to the care of the offspring, or perhaps the care of siblings or relatives' offsprings and so forth. I will say that this curve is tied to natural selection. So selection is going to feel stronger all the way up until we hit the peak. Then the effect of selection is going to start to diminish as we're on the decline, because our reproductive value is going to be much, much less. Any selection that's going to happen at traits that appear after our peak, or even after we stop reproducing, selection is going to have a very hard time removing those traits, because we've already reproduced, and thus selection really doesn't do a whole lot for us. All right, so we talked about changes in this age. It's going to change in shape. It changes in shape because of survivorship. It's going to change in shape because of fecundity. And our relationships is that if we can survive to reproduce, we're going to become more and more valuable. So as our survivorship increases, we're going to increase our value. Second thing was fecundity. So BX was that maternity schedule or birth schedule. We're going to be more valuable if we have more offspring. And also, once we reach reproductive maturity. So this peak is saying we are now reproductively mature. We're at our highest reproductive value at that point. Now this shape is a general shape. It's going to be triangle shaped. All right? They're all basically going to be triangle shaped, but that shape of that triangle is going to vary. All right? You can have very rapid peak early on. You can have a longer delay going up and then a sharp drop off. All right? The shape of this curve all depends on the life history strategy itself. So if we change one aspect of our life history strategy, going from having one offspring to having two offspring every time we reproduce, that's going to change the shape of our curve. If we delay our reproduction for a year, that's going to change the shape of our curve. So anything that affects our life history strategy is going to have an effect on this curve, and thereby affect what our overall fitness is going to be. Now, how do we measure that overall fitness? Our overall fitness for our strategy is the area underneath our curve. By taking the area underneath our curve, we account for all ages. We account for the reproductive value at all ages. The more area you have, the higher the fitness. The less area you have, the less fitness you have. So compare these two strategies. All right, so black line is strategy 1, blue line strategy 2. And I could ask you, which of these has the highest fitness? Which strategy has the highest fitness? And what would you say? Strategy 1 or strategy 2? You vote for that? 2? Yeah, strategy 2. Why? How do I know that? It's because it has the higher area under the curve. Yeah, strategy 1 has the highest peak. Reproductive value is going to be highest when this individual, when this species or population hits reproductive maturity. But you note, everything's very compressed. It's only reproducing over this short age. So perhaps in this strategy, we invested everything into reproducing early, put all of our effort in reproduction at the cost of reproducing numerous times, or perhaps living longer so that we can reproduce numerous times. Yeah, we may have a higher peak, but this is the only value we have. Look at that area under the curve, pretty small. Our second strategy has a strategy where we delay reproduction. So instead of putting all of that energy into reproduction, maybe we put it into growth. We put it into survival. All right? So we live longer, we reproduce over a longer period of time, but our peak is lower. And that's okay. We're not comparing the peaks. What we're comparing is the area under the curve. So just looking at these two curves, strategy 2 has the higher area. All right? Now, these comparisons, these types of comparisons, are only valid for the strategies that we're comparing. So if one of the strategy changes, we have to remake that reproductive value curve. All right, that was on our previous slide. But also, these curves are only valid for the current environmental conditions. Why is that? Why are they dependent on our environmental conditions? What's that? Yeah, so environment's constantly changing, so what does that do to our fitness? It's going to change our fitness. So go back, again, properties of fitness. The 3 properties of fitness. It's the property of the genotype. Yeah, if we change a strategy, it's probably a genetic change. We're going to change our overall VX curve, which changes our fitness. Second property of fitness is that it's a property of the environment. So our fitness is determined by the environment itself. If the environment changes, so does our fitness, and so does our overall shape of the curve. All right, and then our third property is we measure it over more than one generation. All right? So, we've talked about these curves, and I've already alluded to the fact that these life history strategies do have a genetic component to them. And because they're genetically determined, natural selection can act on them. Selections, if it has 2 populations that overlap and are in the same area, this strategy, whichever population has this strategy, is going to win out. Selection favors this strategy because it has a higher overall fitness. You can say the same thing about an individual. If most of the population is like this, but then a mutation appears that changes our strategy, and that individual now has a VX curve like this, selection is going to favor that individual. This individual, over their lifespan, is going to leave more offspring and thus slowly increase in frequency in our population. All right? So this is a genetic component. Selection can act on it. But we also know that life history strategies can be plastic. So we've talked about phenotypic plasticity. We talked about how to separate genetic component versus the plastic component using those reciprocal transfer studies. The same thing applies to these strategies. And there's a reason. If we're phenotypically plastic, it allows us to survive in a changing environment. It's easier to alter a strategy, alter a plastic strategy, if the environment changes, than it is to initiate genetic change in our environment. So we can talk about, or we can ask, well, what types of changing conditions favor a phenotypically plastic response? And you can go back and actually find that information. I'm going to let you do that. We've covered it. We've talked about it. We're kind of bringing it back in terms of these life history strategies now. All right, so strategy number 1 may be favored in one set of conditions. Strategy number 2 could be favored in a second set of conditions. Great example of this are tadpoles. Tadpoles in ephemeral ponds. All right, how long it takes them to metamorphose into adults kind of depends on how long that pond is going to last, or that pool of water is going to last. So you have this life history strategy that says we're going to take X number of days or live X number of days in the tadpole stage and then transition to the adults. And we see that if you put them in same genetic population, put them in 2 different pools, you can see 2 different times of when they start to metamorphose. What's the trigger? They sense density changes. They sense that the density changes kind of relate to the drying out of the pond itself. that's a phenotypically plastic response, and that's related to our life history strategy. When should we metamorphose? Why is that beneficial? Because if it was under selection and we were supposed to stay in a tadpole stage for 35 days, but the pond dries up in 20, well, all those tadpoles died. So if they can adjust their strategy, if they can be plastic in their strategy, it allows them to survive within that uncertainty. Questions about that? All right, quick summary on this. Our life history strategies, it's a suite of all of these traits. All right? And these strategies themselves have evolved. The two key factors, two key selective forces that drive all of this is going to be our environmental variability and our external mortality factors. You can say that both of these are selection at work. All right? So the type of our uncertainty, is it harsh, is it moderate, is it predictable, is it unpredictable, is it frequent, is it infrequent, all of that stuff. That's our environmental variability, and everything that we've learned about that and how organisms should respond also apply to these life history strategies. In terms of the external mortality factors, it comes down to survivorship. What does our prospect of survival look like? If it looks like we can live for a long time, then we don't necessarily have to invest immediately into reproduction. We can invest into survival to ensure that we get to that reproductive age. Both of these things are going to affect our overall strategy. They're going to affect our VX curves. Now, why does this matter? How are life history strategies shaped? Well, it all comes down to a trade-off of energy allocation. Our organism has a finite amount of energy that it can spend on those three main processes, on growth, reproduction, and maintenance. All right? Within each of those, then, we have a series of trade-offs on how we should allocate it. So if we have a fixed amount of energy allocated to growth, well, are we going to invest it all just like overall growth? Should we only grow certain structures and so forth? You've got all of these series of trade-offs because once you invest in one aspect, that energy is now unavailable to be spent in all of the other aspects. So you've got these trade-offs, and with these trade-offs, evolution tries to maximize the fitness. So those organisms that made the best decision on how to allocate the energy are going to have higher fitness, and selection is going to favor those. Our proxy for fitness is this reproductive value, and we can't, even though we calculate reproductive value for individuals, all right, individual ages, our fitness, the proxy for fitness for these strategies is the entire curve itself. It's that area under the curve, and we have to look at the area under the curve. We don't look at the peak. We don't look at when the peak occurs. It's the overall area. And just kind of what we just finished up, yeah, there is a genetic component. Genetics determines how we age, how many offspring we have, our desire to give parental care and so forth, but we also have phenotypic plasticity in those traits. All right, questions? So we finished optimization. That quiz goes live later today. I believe I gave you until Sunday or Monday to do the quiz. We're kind of running out of time because we have an exam on Friday, and I'd like to get the quizzes in to at least give you a chance to review, do a quick test over this material, and if you had questions, you have time to email me those questions before our exam on Friday. All right. So that's our optimization. And now we're going to move on to our different strategies, or the components of our strategies. So as we said, life history strategies represent a suite of traits, a suite of traits. We broke those traits down into life cycles, lifespan, and reproductive effort. All right? So we're going to start with life cycles. Start with life cycles. All right, so there's three key features of our life cycles that we can discuss. as it comes down to our strategies, life history strategies. All right? We have development of an individual from our embryo to the adult. How do we do that? What should we do that? And this is basically a distinction between having a simple life cycle or having a complex life cycle. All right? And simple and complex kind of takes on a similar meaning in the parasite world. So those of you that took parasitology, we talk about our complex life cycles. In that case, our complex life cycles do have multiple larval stages. All right? And our simple life cycles really don't. And the same kind of thing applies here to our free-living organisms. So first part of the life cycle, should we have a simple or should we have a complex life cycle? The second aspect is, should we have a resting stage in our life cycle? Should we have it at any point? So what's our resting stage? This is a developmental stage in which an organism is dormant, inactive, and often resistant to harsh environmental conditions. Normally, it's the resistance to harsh environmental conditions that kind of starts to favor the development and persistence of these stages in our life cycle. And then lastly, our final component is the development and constancy of an organism's sex. So once we're born, should we maintain our sex or should we switch our sex at some point during our life? And we'll talk about when the sex changes should happen, or what would favor them anyways. All right? So development. We're going to start with our simple life cycles. Our simple life cycles are those life cycles where we go egg to juvenile to adult. So basically, you're going from that embryo all the way to the adult stage, and those intermediate stages, that juvenile stage that we're living in, is essentially like a miniature version of the adult. We're not going to see any major reorganization of our body plans. We're not going to go through any major restructuring. It's just basically growth that'll be, bigger individuals are the adults. In these simple life cycles, our sex is genetically determined. So we're not going to go through we can't go through a transition period. Whatever our genes say the sex we're going to be, that's what we're going to be. Now, don't get hung up on mutations that lead to being genetically one sex but phenotypically another sex. We're just going to talk about the genetics and assume that whatever the genetics says, that's what we're going to function as. All right? This simple life cycles exhibit direct development. Direct development is a process where our adult develops from a fertilized egg without having a larval stage. And our larval stage is having some body plan that's different from the adult itself. So humans, great example of direct development. Yeah, you go through periods of embryonic development, but once we're born, we're basically miniature versions of adults, more or less. You've seen those videos of like proportions where, if you took a baby and actually scaled them up to the adults, they'd got like massive heads, right? Yeah, we're not going to talk about proportions, but you get the idea. That's our direct development. Our complex life cycles exhibit metamorphic development. All right, so in our complex life cycles, we have our egg to a larval stage to an adult, and this larval stage, the transition from the larval stage to the adult, usually involves a pretty drastic change in our body plan. Now, I say usually because not always. All right, fish go through this complex life cycle. They have a larval stage. They go through a form of metamorphosis. All right, and you can actually see it in their development that happens. That is a change in the body plan. It's not super severe, in contrast to some of our insects, our butterflies, where you've got this caterpillar that has to undergo a drastic change in the body plan to get to our butterfly stage, to our adult. Now, in these complex life cycles, you can have a resting stage, and you often do see resting stages in these life cycles. The stages could be either as part of the egg, where the eggs persist, those are the resting stages, or it could be at our transition, so a pupal stage. These life cycles could also include a change in gender. So change in our functioning. So change from functionally male to functionally female, or vice versa. All right, so I said this is metamorphic development. That's our complex life cycles, and it includes our larval stage. Not to be outdone, plants and some algae have evolved something a little bit different, and it is something called the alternation of generations. In this alternation of generations, it's exactly what we're meaning, is that you're going to have basically two different types of generations in one sexual cycle of these plants. All right, so in these plants and algae that exhibit alternation of generations, we're going to have two different stages. We're going to have a distinct gametophyte growth stage, and you're going to have a distinct sporophyte growth stage. The gametophyte growth stage is going to be haploid. So it's not like a temporary stage. It doesn't appear then disappear real quickly. This is a distinct growth form. All right? It's haploid. And these gametophytes produce our gametes. They're going to be released. The gametes then fuse, and they form our diploid zygote, which then develops into our diploid sporophyte. Again, it's the sporophyte. I keep saying sporozoites because, man, we talk a lot about sporozoites in the parasitology class. These sporophytes for our plants are distinct growth forms. All right, so we've got a haploid gametophyte growth form, and we have a diploid sporophyte growth form. These sporophytes are going to undergo meiosis to produce the haploid spores, which then, you can say, germinate, they grow into our haploid gametophyte stage. All right? So you've got this alternation of generation where we have a growth form that's diploid, and then you have a growth form that's haploid. And this is our alternation of generations between our haploids and diploid stages. A full cycle, going from sporophorite through the gametophyte back to a sporophorite, would represent sexual reproduction in plants. Now, not all algae do this. Right? So, it's a decision. Should we do it this way or should we not? And then those of you that had parasitology, yeah, there is some similarities in terms of diploid and haploid stages, but I wouldn't necessarily call them a true alternation of generations there. All right, so let's talk about metamorphosis. Simple, because this is basically the decision. Should we have a simple life cycle stage? Should we have a complex stage? Complex life cycle. And if we have a complex life cycle, that's going to involve some form of metamorphosis. Now, our metamorphosis usually entails a drastic change in our body plan, and that happens between our larval stage and the adult. This change in body plan is going to affect a lot of the ecological interactions of our organism, because you're changing the organism's role. You're changing their niche space from a larval stage to the adult stage. And that has some benefits, but it also has some disadvantages. So the disadvantages of having metamorphic development is that it's extremely expensive. All right? You're growing as the one growth form, and then all of a sudden, you're investing all of this energy to basically change your entire body plan. That's a lot of energy to do. Not only that, but you also have to maintain the genetic system and the complex regulatory system that allows you to detect the environment and know when to actually undergo this change. All right, so it's not just change in body plan. We also have to maintain all of that genetics, all of the regulatory pathways that are there. The second disadvantage is that we do have an increased risk of mortality. During our transition, our organism is usually vulnerable to predators. They normally have to stay still. Think of cocoons, butterfly, cocoons or whatever. They're stationary. They can't run off. They can't hide. If they sense a predator, they're there. They're susceptible to increased predation risk. Now, These are pretty big disadvantages, but since we see metamorphosis actually happening, you should know that the benefits exceed our costs. So what are the benefits? And the benefits are actually two different types of benefits, two different approaches. Number one, change in our body plan changes our ecology. That means that we can utilize and exploit two different types of habitats depending on our body plan. So you can, as a larval stage, you can exploit one habitat type, and then as an adult, you can exploit another habitat type. Why is that important? Well, number one, you avoid competition with your offspring or with your parents. The larval stages are inhabiting and utilizing the resources in one habitat. They don't encounter the adults. They don't interact with the adults. There's no competition there. And then the adults are in another area interacting, acquiring food, competing with other organisms. But again, there's no overlap there. They're not competing. So you've got exploitation of different habitats that leads to decreased competition between offspring and parents. The second major thing is that the exploitation may allow us to capitalize on temporary and highly productive habitats. So think of those ephemeral ponds for the tadpoles. Those ponds usually have high rates of primary production. What's one of the major food sources of tadpoles? Algae. Those are very highly productive. Capitalize on that. Utilize those as a larval stage, and then when they disappear, transform, metamorphose into an adult stage and utilize a different habitat that's going to be more stable, more permanent. All right, in some cases, you can think of, let's say, newts and salamanders. All right, they utilize the streams and stuff for their larval stages, and then they move out as adults onto land to reproduce. You do have that limited competition, but in that case, they're I think the water, or the suggestion is that the water's providing a more stable type of environment for growth. If you're interested, check out, newts and salamanders. They've got some pretty cool ideas. Things that we don't know 100%, but some speculation as to why they do what they do. So the second benefit is that you have a specialized body plan for a specific purpose. So it's not necessarily exploitation of habitats. Some of that you can apply to this, like mayflies. But what we've done is basically you have your body plan, your larval body plan, your adult body plan, and they're going to be formed for a specific purpose. So our mayflies, those larvae are in an aquatic system. Their role is to feed, to grow. They're specialized at that. And then once they become an adult, basically the only role the adult plays in the mayfly life cycle is to reproduce. They emerge, they reproduce. They do not live long. You've got, in some cases, hours to get out and reproduce before you die. Or maybe days. Maybe you have a week or two. But that's it. Coral represents another example. So their larval stages are actually planktonic. All right? So our adult coral, they release sexual stages, gametes then fuse, form these planktonic larvae. These are great for dispersing. They get caught up in the water currents of the ocean. They get carried to new areas. All right? Their stages, their larval stages, are adapted for dispersal. And then once they settle down and attach, then they undergo transformation to start the process of becoming an adult whose specialization is growth and reproduction. So benefits, exploitation of different habitats and the benefits that come from that, as well as the specialized body plans for specific functions. These benefits exceed our costs. That's why we see them. That's why they've persisted. Resting stages is the second part of our life cycles part. All right? And I'm going to say go back and look at all our previous lectures for the resting stages. We've spent some time on why we have resting stages, what their benefits are. Briefly, it's all about avoidance of these harsh conditions. All right? And I believe we've had it where we talked about under what types of conditions should resting stages evolve. Go back and look at those because the same things apply here. Same things apply here. Now, when we have these resting stages, they're usually part of our developmental life cycle. So it's oftentimes going to be in the egg or the seed stage. Some cases, it's going to be in the metamorphic stage. In some places, in the same groups, in the same, let's say, family, or in a single genus. The resting stage differs. So if you're interested in some moths, talk to Dr. Strength. There's moth here where the eggs of these moth overwinter. That's their resting stage. But in another species, the eggs hatch, you get your larval stage that feeds, and then the pupal form. They pupate, and the pupa survive the winter. That's their larval stage. So, don't just think, well, all moths do this. This is where their resting stage is. It's going to be dependent on our species. If we're going to have our resting stages, that resting stage is going to be synchronized so that it coincides with our harsh conditions. And this is about all we're going to say about resting stages because we've covered it earlier in the lectures. What we haven't talked about a whole lot is the change in sex. We did talk about it, how sex is determined. That was as part of our sex ratios. All right? But we're going to talk about it here because this could be a strategy, could be a life history strategy. So in our simple life cycles, sex is determined early in development, and it's going to remain constant. So you've got your genetics, your genes say if you're going to be male or female, and then during development, if something goes wrong, there's normally default sex that the organism will develop into. And that is going to remain constant throughout their life. But in some of our complex life cycles, our organisms exhibit what's known as sequential hermaphroditism. Man, that's a long word. Sequential hermaphroditism. Geez, say that 3 times. Sequential hermaphroditism. And what that means is that we're going to undergo a sex change during our lifespan. Sometimes it's going to be programmed, and it is guaranteed to occur. Other times, it only occurs if there's an environmental signal that says, hey, we need to change sex. All right? So, in some cases, our sex could change multiple times, and it could change based on the conditions. Example was Jack in the Pulpit, and we talked about Jack in the Pulpit as our sex ratios and how environment affected the sex. So what was the Jack in the Pulpit? That was those plants that were in a forest. How much energy they received determined if they were going to produce a female flower or a male flower. All right, why was that? Well, the female flowers cost more. They cost more to produce. There was more risk of reproductive failure because you've got one shot to basically get pollinated and produce a seed. So if that plant was in the sun, it was in full sun, if it had abundant nutrients, it's going to produce that female flower. It's saying, times are good, let's invest in this more costly sex to try to take advantage of it. But if conditions were poor, if we're in the shade or if the soil conditions are poor, let's invest in the male. We don't have to necessarily attract anything. We can just produce the pollen and hope that some of our pollen gets to another plant. And it's not just one, female part. It's thousands of pollen molecules that has a chance to go out, and you only need one of those, one pollen to find a female plant. And with the Jack in the Pulpit, it could vary. So, as it develops, it could be female one year, it could be male another year. All right, it's based on our conditions. In some cases, our sex is developmentally programmed or triggered by the environmental condition. Now, what I'm saying here with the triggered by environmental condition, it's different from the Jack in the Pulpit where it assesses an environment and then produces the correct flower type. In this one, we're going to be programmed to be male, let's say, and then all of a sudden we receive a signal and we transition to female, and then we live out the rest of our life as a female, or vice versa. Maybe we start as a female, and then we receive a signal, and we transition to male, and then we live the rest of our life as a male. All right? This is going to be adaptive. This type of strategy is going to be adaptive if our reproductive success varies by our age, or varies by our size, or varies by some aspect that changes over the course of our life. Now, with the sex, this reproductive success, I don't want you to only think about reproductive output, like how many offspring you can have. I also want you to consider the chances of surviving to reproduce, because that goes into our reproductive success. Basically, this reproductive success is our VX curve that's affected both by survivorship and by our reproductive output. All right? So there's two different types of patterns that we could exhibit. Protandrous is when our individuals are born male and then they transition to female later in life. Under this situation, we would see it when our reproductive output is correlated with maybe size of our female, or perhaps risk of mortality is really high for the females during reproduction. All right, so why is this? Well, if our reproductive output, let's say reproductive output scales with size of the female. So larger females have more offspring, smaller females have smaller offspring. If you have this strategy, it favors you to be a male early on, because you're not just reproducing once. You have a chance of reproducing multiple times, I should say, reproducing with multiple females each time you do have this reproductive period. All right, it's not just a one shot. I'm going to reproduce and produce my one offspring. So be a male first, because you can potentially mate with many females. But then as you get larger, transition to female. Now you're going to mate, but instead of having one offspring, maybe you're now producing 5 or 6 offspring. All right? It favors you more to do that than to be a female and only produce one offspring early on. Jeez, this is ridiculous. The second part of that is mortality during reproduction. So if the risk of mortality is high when you do reproduce, then just the act of reproduction serves as kind of a gamble. If I try to reproduce, there's a chance that I actually don't complete reproduction and don't produce that offspring. And if that risk is higher for a female, then it benefits you more to be a male first, because your mortality risk for the male is going to be much lower. So try to get in several mating events over the course of the life, and then invest in that costly female reproductive stage. Now, I say it's costly, and it is, because if you fail to reproduce, if you have reproductive failure, it's complete. Whereas with the male, if there's reproductive failure, if the female that they mated with failed in reproducing, the male could be mating with another individual at that time. That's kind of our cost. Second pattern is this protogynous, you can say, protogynous. It's a reverse. We're first female, and then we become male. And it's going to be the reverse of the first one. So now we have to think about our mortality rates. Normally, this is going to be reproductive success is what determines this. So if our reproductive success for the male depends on status and size, and let's say holding territory, but so that there's no guarantee that the male is actually going to reproduce, but pretty much all the females reproduce. Here's a situation where you can be female first. You can guarantee that you're going to get some reproductive events over the course of your life, and then transition to male when you're older, when you're bigger, and when you're more likely to obtain territory or the best mates. All right? So you kind of have to think about what is going to be our highest reproductive value, and switch our sexes so that we maximize that value. All right, so life cycles. Quick summary. Life cycles can be simple or complex. The evolution of our complex life cycles are going to depend on many things we have to consider, including the costs and the benefits of all of that. All right. Sometimes we're going to have to consider whether or not we need resting stages. We're going to have to consider if we're going to change our sexes. All right. So there's a lot of things with our life cycles, especially if we deal with the complex life cycles. If we do have a complex life cycle, if we do have metamorphosis, then there's costs and benefits. If it's going to persist, then we know that our benefits exceed the cost of it. What were the costs? Well, it's energetically expensive, and we have to maintain this complex regulatory system. Oh geez, I left off the other cost, increased mortality risk. So energetically expensive, you've got to maintain the regulatory network, and we have our increased mortality risk during that transition period. Benefits, though, is that we can exploit 2 different habitats, thereby reducing our competition with adults and larval stages. And by exploiting these different habitats, we can have specific body plans for specific functions. So maybe we're going to have growth stages, feeding stages in those ephemeral habitats to take advantage of a highly productive area, and then get out of that area because it's only temporary, and thus transition to our second body plan stage. And we just finished up with sex, which again, it could be genetically and developmentally fixed, like it is in a simple life cycle. All right. Some of our metamorphic life cycles, complex life cycles, are also developmentally fixed. But some of our complex life cycles actually involve a change in the sex. All right. Could be programmed so that it's always going to happen. Could be in response to the environmental conditions. I had the picture of the clownfish. That is one where most of the fish are of one sex, and then once that dominant sex, once that one individual leaves, or once they sense that there's not enough, then one of them will start to transition sexes to kind of take its place. There's a lot of variation in these sex changes. But what I want you to know is, in order to decide which way we should transition, you have to consider survivorship and you have to consider reproductive success, overall reproductive success. If any of it varies by age or size or resources or status, then it may be beneficial for an organism to undergo this sex change. Not always, but it could be beneficial. All right? Questions? All right, so these life cycles, I have a quiz. I will get that released. So now you've got 2 quizzes. So one quiz, I got to notice, that quiz went live about 8:30 today. Take it. I think it's by Monday. This quiz also will go released, so you've got 2 different presentations to take by Monday. On Monday, we will talk about our lifespans, what affects aging and so forth, what determines our lifespans. There's a quiz on that, and I do believe we'll finish that presentation on Monday, and then that presentation ends our content for exam 3. All right? So our exam 3 goes up through our lifespan. All right. Enjoy the weekend. Stay safe.